everybody. Welcome to another fantastic Sales Hacker webinar. I am your host today, Colin Campbell. You know me, the Director of Marketing at Sales Hacker. And today, I am extremely lucky. In fact, we're all very lucky to be joined by two amazing people. First of all, we've got Colby Henard. Look at me, messing up already. More to come. Colby Henard is the Director of Sales at Showpad. He's got previous experience at a company called Wildfire, which was acquired by Google in 2012. He worked at Google for a while. All kinds of great sales, social media, and enablement experience from Colby today. He's also an advisor at HitCheck now. We're also joined by Greer. Kira is the head of global sales enablement at a company called Hired. And she's really actually got her hands in all kinds of different things. So she's been working with companies like Salesforce and Marketo, Lockheed Martin, who else, Kira? Sony, on things like designing sales onboarding plans, helping design learning and development budgets, all kinds of these things and activities that revolve around the world of sales enablement. And now she runs it at Hired. So we're going to hear a little bit about the state of sales enablement today. We're going to hear a lot about how the principles, what goes into sales enablement, because I've spoken to dozens of people in sales enablement and I've asked them what's their area of focus, what are they trying to achieve. I've gotten dozens of different answers. And but the one thing that doesn't change, there are a couple ingredients to successful sales enablement everywhere. So Kira and Colby are going to lay that out for us. No matter what your context, you're going to walk away with a framework of priorities, how to build a really successful sales enablement program today. So Colby, Kira, thanks so much for giving us your time today and welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to have you. So before we jump into the meaty stuff here, I know we're all rearing to get going, but two really quick things. Everybody always asks, first of all, we are recording this webinar. So you people, you kind audience members there, if you have to run away to something or you get interrupted or you just want to share this with a colleague, we'll send you the recording afterwards, so don't worry. Number two is please right now go down to the bottom of your screen and click that little Q&A button, pop that open for us, and tell us, what do we want to know? I want to know what's your function in the company. So if you're a sales enablement person, tell us that. If you're a rep, tell us that. Sales ops, I want to know what you do and what company you work for. Lead development manager. Hi, Joe. Welcome. SDR manager. Okay. Business operations at Solace. Hi, Rose. Training and development specialist. Global enablement at Alteryx. Hey, Wendy. Sales operations manager, sales ops at Frontify. Hey, Samuel. Sales coach. Somebody who owns their own business and does work with sales orgs. That includes enablement. Hey, Barb. Welcome back. Barb and I are tight. Okay, so sales ops. We've got some directors of sales enablement. We've got some SDRs. A good mix here today. Thanks, everybody. Keep that Q&A box open. You're in the live version for a reason. And Kira doesn't want to just hear herself talk. Colby doesn't want to just spout nonsense at you. Let's make this a conversation. So, sorry, Colby, I know you don't spout nonsense.
No, that's okay.
So if you've got questions about sales enablement, if you've got questions about what you're working on, fire them at us and we'll try to get them answered for you. That's my spiel, everybody. You don't have to listen to me anymore. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Colby. Colby, can you share your screen and we'll take a look at what we're looking through today?
I absolutely will.
All right, so we'll click through here a couple, because I already made introductions. I talked a lot. We talked about the housekeeping stuff. We're good there. This is who we are. You'll get the deck after everybody too, if you want to look us up. Okay, so we're going to start with, just to frame this conversation a little bit. What is the challenge with sales enablement? I touched on it a little bit. It's different in a lot of different contexts, but it's actually much bigger than that. So we're going to unpack that. What are the main challenges? We're going to share the solution, which is kind of this framework that I mentioned. It works in a lot of different contexts and scenarios. And then we're going to wrap it up with just some notes on like how you can kind of bring this all together and bring your org all together around a sales enablement program that works. Okay, I'm done talking, everybody. Let's get into the meat. Colby, can you kick us off?
Awesome. Yeah, I'll absolutely kick us off, and appreciate everybody's time who's on the line. We're going to move pretty quickly through some of my material. I think you guys are probably all incredibly excited to hear from an actual practitioner in Kira. But hopefully I can, paint a bit of a picture on the sales enablement landscape. And I guess let's start, what's in a name and why is this important? So first and foremost, sales enablement in itself is absolutely booming. Right? When you look at the number of LinkedIn users that have the words sales enablement in their job title, it's almost doubled from 2016, which is incredible. And there's real reason why this is happening. And when we actually look at research by the Miller-Heiman Group, the results show themselves, right? So organizations that have a formal enablement process in place and are making that investment in an enablement strategy are exceeding quota goals at a much higher rate, as well as they're just closing business at a higher rate. And for pretty much every organization out there, we're always looking for ways to drive more revenue faster. So the alignment of growth and the explosion of enablement practitioners are very well aligned. And one of the things, we really want to look at is, so what are some of like the typical, challenges enablement organizations are charged with solving? And I think just from a high level, everybody out there can probably agree, as we head into 2019 very, very quickly, revenue targets are probably higher than they ever have been, and the expectations around those are higher. Buyers are more sophisticated. Marketers are doing a phenomenal job at educating them. So that's a challenge. Competition is always there. And with all of these things in place, the lens on sales and sales performance has never been higher. So when we look at, your traditional challenges, across, let's say sales and marketing, sales, it's all about delivering against quota. How can we ramp new reps faster? How can we turn mid-performers into top performers? How can we increase active selling time? And inevitably, when we get down to the point of attack, how can we ensure that our reps are ready to articulate value? And on the marketing side of the world, it's all about, hey, we're going to make these strategic investments, and how can we actually prove impact across the bottom line? And really, we see enablement here as a critical function to help deliver on all of these challenges and expectations that we're seeing across the sales organization.
Well, one of the things I've heard people talking about that, I don't know, maybe you disagree, but I think this accounts for some of the investment and some of the attention on these more specialized sales roles like sales enablement, is that buyers have more information than ever. So it's less about what you're selling and more about how you're selling. What do you think of that, Colby and Kira? Do we think that accounts for the growth here in some way?
I would say that that's a really great initial pass on it. Yes, the buyer is more complex and more informed than ever before, but also the core shift in the market and also the general aging of the population has also shifted the desires and needs in a different direction than traditional sales fulfillment has existed in its previous lives. So, I mean, that's part of my theory on it. I don't know. Colby?
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, and look, like I think overall, I can't remember I think it may have been CEB. I can't remember the exact organization, but 53% of B2B buyers today are buying because of the buyer experience alone ahead of product and price. And like we look at why this is happening, right? As consumers, we are so well conditioned by companies like Amazon, Netflix, on down the line that provide us with these superior experiences as consumers. And that same buying behavior that we're conditioned with from a B2C world is bleeding into the B2B world. So, the expectation is that when we show up, they know who we are and, we're ready to articulate something that's valuable and insightful for the organization. And, that isn't easy to do.
Yeah, I love that take. That makes total sense.
Cool. So let's just talk about, who owns sales enablement and what it is. And Kira, absolutely at any point as a practitioner, feel free to jump in here. But, a lot of enablement people are transitioning into the role. And with that comes a lot of, siloed technology, siloed goals that are set across the organization. And, there's quite a bit of people on this call. And enablement a lot of times exists in a lot of different functions of the business. We see it reporting into ops, we see it reporting to sales, we see it reporting to marketing or product marketing. But inevitably, it's critical for enablement practitioners, to drive alignment between these teams, right? Because you're really not going to drive the success all by yourself. So driving alignment around, okay, well, what is our charter? What does enablement do here? What are the goals that we're set out to actually achieve? And then there's other, tactical things that are typically inherited by enablement practitioners, which is, again, when you step into the role, a lot of times there's this siloed technology that you're inheriting that was brought into the organization to solve a very specific point solution, right? So, owning these tools, trying to transform these tools into something that's meaningful for enablement, developing things like onboarding programs, if they already exist, potentially owning those programs. So realistically, it's a big mix. And one of the things that, I see a lot of really strong enablement teams and practitioners doing is I really see them as almost like a filter for sales, right? There's so much noise that's happening in an organization at any given point from all of these different places. And really strong enablement teams do a great job of distilling that down for sales in the context of, their sales motions.
And
absolutely.
so to dovetail on that, yes, and yes, and yes again. The ownership of sales enablement in some cases can be, as Colby's acknowledged, it can sometimes be an individual, it can sometimes be a team. It really varies by the organization, but ultimately the responsibility of the enablement should be one in service to the success of the broader business. It's not just sales, because sales sits at that very odd intersection between product, marketing, and the actual generation of revenue from a customer perspective. It's a prioritization in many cases of both the broader organizational goals and then, helping coach and lead and sometimes prod and reorganize. It's kind of a hybrid change man role, or at least that's what I'm seeing in my experience. It sort of started out initially as just a functional trainer role, and it's now turning much more into a partnership. I'm trying, I will admit, in all of my prior roles and with clients as well, that I work in a very partnership, organizationally partnershiped role. Does that make sense? Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And so in that framework where you view yourself as a partner of all these different stakeholders, your job is as a filter. You're agreeing with Colby that it's like there's so much coming at. Sometimes it's not about giving salespeople more. Sometimes it's about peeling away what's not actually helping, right?
Exactly. And in some cases, that means that you have to build that trust and that team accountability to have the right very much to sell internally, not only this role, but to sell your ability to be that filter. The first opportunity that you have to speak up and say, nah, that's not the right time, or this isn't the right venue. That's where I think the real power of the role comes into play, where it's not just, functional order takers, but it's really a strategic partner to determine now is the right time for this product rollout, or, hey, let's take a step back and be very considered about changing a process, and what does it take to deliver that change and monitor that change and actually measure that change.
Yeah, so tell me if you want to unpack this later on in the conversation, but one of the things that I think would be helpful to understand there is, like, when you have inputs coming from every direction, people teach the salespeople this, help them use this tool better. What's your source of truth for determining what is and is not a priority at any given time?
Actually, that might be a really good one to open up. I would say that at least for myself, one of the things that actually we're getting in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee is saying that it's not only the unique value, but it's the relevant value. So it's, making sure that as an enablement professional, you're very keyed in both to the individual contributors' perspective, but then you have to be able to scale up to see both the organizational and departmental goals and how they feed into one another and being able to translate that effectively. I would sort of open that up to the broader group maybe a little bit later, but yeah, I'd love to dig into this.
Let's come back to it. Cool.
Yeah, and Kira, to your point, I just think just from like a very broad perspective, I mean, that alignment's critical. Like for us, we have frontline managers that are noticing potential skill gaps or knowledge gaps, and as frontline leaders, we're bubbling that up to our enablement teams and organization. But here, just like you mentioned, there's also MBOs and things like that all of these things need to align with. So I just think in general, building that communication strategy to bring things not only top down but from bottom up is absolutely critical. Great. So let's just talk about a platform where sellers live. Inevitably, again, with a lot of practitioners moving into enablement, there is a lot of technology and infrastructure that typically exists that you very quickly either take ownership of or are heavy influencers of. And I think the common challenge for a lot of organizations is if you're like anybody else, you're probably investing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on a lot of different types of technology. So things like content management systems to store files, intranets, file repositories, things just house the information that we all need. Secondly, massively important, CRMs, right? We need to collect data about our customers and prospects, but realistically, the function of CRM exists for us to predict our business so we can understand where we're going and make strategic investments based on that data. And lastly, the marketing tech stack, right? Everybody's got one. They're typically big, and things like marketing automation, for example, allowing us to provide those personalized experiences at scale. And all of these platforms are incredibly important. But none of these tools, as we see it, are actually built for the seller. And sales enablement is really for the seller itself, right? We see enablement as the function where people are going to get the knowledge, the coaching, the feedback, as well as the content that they need to go out and have conversations. And at Showpad in particular, we see this and have seen this as a massive opportunity, which is why we've actually created an integrated platform for sellers and sales managers to elevate their buying experience by having that one place to get the content, the training and coaching that they need. So when the rubber hits the road, they can engage with that informed buyer and have a more value-driven, insightful conversation. So I think the last thing, I really want to touch on is, how do you actually deliver, the best buyer experience? And it really starts with this, idea of sales excellence, right? How can we have smart, informed sales reps that are, delivering personalized, value-driven experiences to the field, right? So, to do that realistically, you need a way for people to get, again, that knowledge, the content, training, but also, coaching and feedback, right? Because, a lot of times there's a tendency to deliver training, and then it's like, okay, go and do it. Well, the first time that they actually try to do it, they're doing that in front of customers, right? Their first idea of practice, so to speak, is when they're in front of a customer, and practice is probably, a couple time scenario, right? So we need to make sure that they're ready. They have the knowledge, So when they go out, they can be effective. Now, secondly, you're probably going to want to be armed with the content in the context of that selling scenario to ensure that that experience is also impactful. And inevitably, again, all of this is critical because we have these buyers with higher expectations. So pulling these things together and providing that more differentiated experience to buyers by being informed and having the right materials in the right time, we see as a massive opportunity.
Yeah, I love that angle that it's, I think people think about sales enablement sometimes still as just helping the sellers, but this angle of like, this is really about the buying experience. Everything everybody does in any business ultimately has to benefit a customer at some point, or it's probably not a good long-term investment. So I love thinking about sales enablement this way, in a way that helps both parties build a relationship and makes the seller more effective and makes the buying experience pleasant.
And Colin, one thing you mentioned that I think is also important is, yes, enablement is a lot about, that seller, the actual person that's going out and delivering. But, it also, when you look at, change management, especially across any sales organization, one of the critical components to driving that is the frontline leadership as well, right? So, looking at not only enabling that end person, but the people that are, in charge of driving performance or responsible for driving performance across the team is absolutely critical as well, because the better you enable them, that all trickles down and will, help drive the change or the behaviors that we're looking to replicate.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so far we've talked a little bit about how we think about sales enablement, the challenges, and the goals of good sales enablement. We've got a great question here that I think is maybe a good segue from Lee Brown. Thank you, Lee, for the question. We wanted to speak a little bit about, I guess, gathering support from an executive team. Like, how do you find a champion and how do you grow alignment there? Because I imagine, Kira, you've had situations or seen situations where that top-down support doesn't exist, and that makes life hard in every way.
Oh boy, does it ever. And I will say, to answer your question, Lee, how to get alignment and support, it's not something that's automatically instilled in an organization. Sometimes it doesn't happen, and it's really just a matter of determining, how much energy and process that you want to try and impact or affect. I will say tactically for myself, it starts with the small wins first. So even if it's something small like, hey, I delivered this particular content and I'm seeing a delta of some kind on this behavior, and, speaking to that and repeating it again and again and again until you get the acknowledgement and recognition. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, early in my career, nobody told me that I had to advocate for myself. And I came from a sales background, which was, 20 years. Oh God, I can't believe I'm saying that. But, coming from a sales background where you had to learn how to push and be aggressive, it definitely benefited me because then I recognized early on in my sales enablement career that I had to do the same. It's not enough to simply say, I'm here and you have to align and this is for your own good. It's no, let me show you the value of what I'm doing. Piecemeal. Let's start small. Let's build a foundation for success, and then you can continue to trust me. And that's how I've done it in the past in particular in executive teams. It also really helps to understand culturally how an organization works. Some are very hierarchical, some are matricized, some are very flat, and each one will have its own flavor within those sort of major categories. It's a very difficult position to be in if you can't speak to the culture and can't understand how people interact with one another and what motivates them, and you try and sort of create that friction by saying this is enablement, or this is what needs to happen. It's I've been on the receiving end of that as well, where I've sort of come in and I said, and this was earlier in my career when I had still was struggling to understand what sales training and or even sales enablement was, that coming from that sales background where it's like you try and fail until you hit on a mix that works. I kind of came in by China in a, bull in a China shop and kept running into things until I found something that worked. And what I really found is that you need to be very, very consultative, and you need to establish very early on what the organization does and how they do it, and align yourself as closely as possible to the culture and to the people that will be your best advocates.
So when you talk about putting a plan in place to achieve that, if you step into an organization now that has no sales enablement, what's your first step? Do you sit down with leadership for like a day and just talk about what is and is not enablement, or is it a weekly meeting? Like how do you go about that?
That's actually a great story, and that's a wonderful segue, Colby. If you're ready to hand over the mic, let's actually segue into the hired story. And if you go to the next section, it's really kind of what happened. I was in a very lucky situation where, the previous enablement leader, understood that there was a desire for it and a need for it, but it was very reactive. And it was sort of like in its early stages, or what I like to say is the nascent enablement function, where it's service oriented and it's really just a functional, a functional fulfillment role rather than a service partner or a SaaS role, because really what I as an enablement professional am providing is a service. And so, along the same lines, it's, needing to move beyond just the reactive process and understanding both, what's going on in the broader organization, and being able to speak to not only the individual needs, but then the organizational needs. So that the first step really is, and if you move to the next one, Colby, is really sort of recognizing and or understanding where everybody is. So yes, I have my own personal 30, 60, 90 that I follow, and I tend to follow it pretty closely. I found that in those situations when I don't follow it, I tend to run into problems. But for the first 30, 60, 90, particularly for the first 30, I tend to, follow a very consultative process of understanding what are the products that are in use, what is the product that the people that are selling are using, what are the processes that are currently in place, what is the process to understand the product, understand the market, understand the buyer, and then finally, what are the people doing? Like, how are we talking to one another? What's the culture like? What are the key motivators, as I mentioned earlier? And then really, the next set of 30 to 60 days is just making sure that everybody, recognizes that, yes, we are all the same colors in the same crayon box, and that it's really sort of, taking those pencils and pens and just saying, okay, can we all kind of agree that this is really sort of what an expectation for success is? And then how do we kind of, sort of set that basics? It's, really taking both the leadership and the individual contributors on the change management process, whether it's, Kubler-Ross or ADKAR or, the McKinsey 7. It's, the early stages of any enablement program at a company really has to be about, let's do the good old fashioned tough footwork of what's going on, and where do you want to be, and what does your future look like, and then reverse engineering from that point. So that's part of it.
I can totally see how before pushing for alignment, it would be useful to just get a sense of what even is the inventory of tools, what's the set of behaviors that's happening, what's the communication, because you can't get alignment if you don't know what you're aligning, right? And also, like, maybe that's a good way to build trust, so you're not the bull in the china shop coming in telling people what to do, and they're like, hey, you don't even know what we're doing now. I can imagine taking an inventory of tools and like watching rep behaviors may be pretty easy. I think I imagine the hard part would be figuring out how people communicate and what their beliefs are about what sales enablement is and what it should be. Mark Ramsey had a great comment here, which is to get the attention of business leaders to start to create that alignment, to start to build a team around the effort, is that he'll paint the picture of what happens if they do nothing regarding sales enablement. Like, what's the risk? what happens to reps down the line? What do customers feel? What does the team look like in a year if we do nothing? What are some other, like, what's the format of driving that initial enablement? Is it a lot of weekly meetings? Do you just walk around the office and talk to people at their desks? Do you hold a big company conference and talk at everybody? How do you do it?
And that's really a very great and detailed focused question. It can vary. What I like to do is I literally start out with listening sessions. Is that the first 30 days is that not only am I going through and doing a tools assessment, but I'm really just giving everybody the open format and forum all the way down to the individual contributor, a forum, depending upon the size of the company, the opportunity to provide feedback that they wouldn't otherwise feel comfortable or safe giving.
Right.
To sort of go ahead and answer Samuel Siegfried's question, which is how do you evaluate the layers or the levers that will have the highest return? Really, it depends upon where the largest pain is. And to be honest, my highest return tends to be tooling and tooling optimization, because inevitably, like every other organization that is either in the growth phase or the hypergrowth phase, everybody's kind of maybe mistakenly considered SaaS as a silver bullet, when in fact it is a service product that still requires the use and application of a product. So in many cases, it's me just going straight after the tools. Like, let's understand, what's the use, what's the adoption rate, and then leaning really heavily into partners like Showpad to determine, what are the best practices for adoption, so that I can at least see that short-term gain, and I can start to get that, tailwind pushing me forward towards more and bigger and larger, more difficult successes. That kind of answers it, but really, to go back to the original question is that how do you align it? I sit in meetings, I send out surveys, I, observe gong calls, or Chorus AI or any other tool if you have to observe calls to figure out, what are the motivations that you can hear and see and spend. I'm actually quite literally going through people's calendars and trying to understand, like, oh, have you got your personal calendar here? Are you using your personal cell phone? Going through kind of stalkerish, and I can't believe I'm actually admitting to this, but I kind of stalk, the high performers and the key players. I try and find out what motivates them, because everybody's on social right now. That means that everybody's life is out there. And you can kind of build profiles for not only the top performers, but the middle performers and the low performers too. And then you can get a little bit at as an end run. If you don't have either the time or the inclination to sit down and talk to people, you can end run a lot of that as well.
When you talked about where do you start, you identify the biggest pain. The pain where you're referring to, is that like a sales org level pain, or is it like an individual rep pain, so that you can understand like the move the middle strategy? Like, who are these people in the middle? What's their biggest pain we can get to get them, top performer?
That's actually really easy to get at. And in many cases, it's part of that whole initial intake process, because every leader is going to say, one variation or another on my team can't perform. Yeah. And it's my team doesn't perform, or they could do this better, or they could do that better. And of course, there's always nuance in the middle. And that's where that, initial feedback and intake process really helps clarify at the individual contributor, what is it going to take? And then again, just clarifying, consistently around what is it going to take to move the needle, and then getting that alignment and that buy-in through, clear established data points in many cases, or sometimes just clear process documentation where it's like, look, here's what you're telling me. Here's, there's the broader picture. I can pull out these pieces here. What are you going to take to, take this whole process and optimize it along with me, because I can't do this alone. I'm not a silver bullet. I am a service, and I can be of both wonderful support, or I can, do nothing, as Mark has managed to very succinctly identify. It really like setting up the partnership.
It sounds like a lot of what you're doing is finding the assumptions that are being made, questioning them, and providing like a if-then scenario for all of these little things in the process. And when you mentioned that one of the biggest pains that you often find is the tools, is it like there's too many, too few, the wrong tool, or just adoption sucks? Like, what's the most common issue there?
I'm laughing just because it's all of the above. And in many cases, it could be none of the above too. It comes down to culture. Culture eats strategy for business. And so what is the culture within the organization prioritizing over everything else? And for a lot of organizations, particularly in the SaaS platform format, there's a lot of sort of desire for efficiency. And so, okay, is efficiency, hygiene, is efficiency, feedback, is efficiency. And again, all of this can sometimes be automated, sometimes it can't be. But really, sometimes it's just making sure that the communication, the definitions, the ideas are all consistent. So moving away from that siloed process that Colby has identified, where sometimes, sales is running in, full speed ahead at, 90 miles an hour in second gear, and product is feeling like they're doing the same, but they're not actually stopping to, identify how are these goals aligning. I will say that I've been very, very lucky in a lot of organizations, and Hired in particular, where there's a lot of time and effort spent on making sure that those goals and those processes are aligned, and it definitely helps to make sure that everybody's aware what everybody else is doing. But sometimes you can get lost in that rabbit hole, and that's where, as a fresh set of eyes, sometimes as enablement or sometimes as an outside partner, I can come in and go, unfortunately, is this what we're aiming for? Being that that voice in the background that goes,
right.
Is this something that is going to be effective in the short term, or is this a longer term process that could use more attention from elsewhere?
And Kira, one thing that you mentioned on alignment is aligning around, data points. And one thing I would just recommend for everybody too is, understand what the baseline metrics, of the business are, as it relates to, go-to-market team, sales, or, just enablement in general. Throughout my time, when I actually was at Wildfire, the same hockey stick we're seeing in enablement practitioners on LinkedIn, I saw the same explosion of social media marketers. At first there's probably going to be like, hey, we need to do this. We see the data. There's, a reason why we should do it. Right. And social media was like, there's these audience, we need to go engage them. And, people would start to engage them, and they, checked a lot of boxes. Right. But then shortly thereafter, people want to just start understanding, well, okay, now that we're actually doing this, how is this impacting our business? And that's why I kind of go back to metrics and understanding, the baseline metrics of the business today, because, wherever you start as a practitioner and, some of the lower hanging fruit you may be picking to, earn some of that trust, as the program continues to formalize, a lot of those questions may start coming back around as the business invests more, which is, okay, show us the impact. So, getting those baseline metrics and alignment around what those metrics are today, should serve as also a strong baseline to show your impact over time.
And I will say that sort of, if you wouldn't mind moving ahead a little bit, Colby, that actually sort of moves into the adoption phase, which is, hopefully after the tough work of talking and listening, comes the opportunity to identify, not only roles, but then expectations and process. And then it's just, the crawl, walk, run mentality, where it's like, let's start small. Let's do the small goals that, or the small tasks, or even the small things that can show immediate short-term gain, so that I can earn the right to continue to, be that enablement partner for product or marketing or sales. And the key thing in that last picture is you are going to fail. There is never going to be 100% win rate. You are going to F up, and it's going to be egg on your face. And it's really a matter of, how you can recoup, and what you decide to recoup to. And again, sometimes it's just, starting back over at the very beginning, crawl, get those small wins up again, and then, continue to get that support all the way through.
Can we talk about small wins versus like the longer term kind of blue sky, here's where eventually we want to end up? What do you usually find yourself identifying as the things you want to tackle first? Like, where are the quick things that are most often?
So tactically, and this is pretty consistent, Salesforce hygiene. CRM hygiene tends to be pretty consistent, and that's because, and in particularly in high growth, and even in large organizations, there is a lot that happens that is either needed as a point of data, or in many cases, people just get comfortable. So for larger organizations, it's, people are kind of comfortable that, they don't necessarily need my information, when in fact, yes, they do. And at hypergrowth, it's just like, it's just, I got to do this quickly. And unfortunately, the thing that sometimes kind of falls by the wayside is, like the hygiene happens. There's a lot of tools out there that can help automate a lot of this, but really it's just reinforcing the expectation of good hygiene for internal process. But then it's also, going back to what Colby had mentioned before, setting definitions, making sure everybody's speaking the same language and that we all understand the expectations consistently across the org. I find those are always the easiest, quickest wins, beyond hygiene. It's, the other really short-term, easy, quick wins are, definitions and setting consistent definitions for, terms. Mm-hmm. Case in point, there's a note from Lydia NBOs. It's actually MBO, so management by objectives. What are those key objectives that at the individual contributor, somebody's going to be held accountable for? And then what are, communicating that transparently across the board consistently. Those are sometimes the quickest and easiest wins. Just to recap, it's, hygiene and then definitions and making sure that those are universally understood.
It makes a lot of sense now that you say that, and maybe I'm just the dummy marketer in the room and just don't know, but I was expecting you to say something like, availability of sales content or something like that. So why is hygiene so crucial to setting like a good start to your sales enablement program?
Colby, as a sales leader, you actually might have a good insight into this.
Yeah, look, Kira, you mentioned it, right? Like everybody needs to be speaking the same language, and expectations need to be clear, right? And the language thing is critical, right? For information to flow through the business. And, when I say something, that means something different than when Kira says something versus when you say it, Colin. Like that's a challenge because it doesn't scale inside of the organization. So, right. That alignment on what things mean when we say them is incredibly important. Because again, it's the only way for us to be predictable if we're speaking that same language. And then
I see. So any tool you bring on later, any extra content you give somebody, you want to know that it's going to be used consistently across the team, that you're not just every rep's doing their own thing with whatever you give them later on.
Yeah, or like, what does, if we're going to bring in a new tool, like we need to be in alignment around, what success of that looks like, right?
Right.
What are we actually doing this for? And are we in agreement that, doing this should have this impact? That way we can all drive towards it.
And
yeah,
actually,
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and sort of to dovetail on that as well, Colby, if you'll advance to the next slide, it's really about accelerating that adoption of, oh, wait, you went a little too far, accelerating both the function of sales enablement, but then accelerating the productivity, the efficiency, whatever the ultimate organizational goal is again, once you've found those short-term wins, you're just, repeatedly being predictable in that endeavor. So these are the three pictures that I've chosen here to talk about, is that really as a player coach or as a leader coach for somebody like Colby, who's in the senior sales leadership, but, making sure that it's clear that these are the expectations. And, again, we're using the same languages, but then also providing the frameworks, which is sort of what that checklist is in the middle, is making sure that people feel confident that if I can accomplish this very, very tactile, small piece, then I can be successful in the long term, because if I've completed this step, then the next step comes. And then finally, of course, adjusting as necessary to make sure that everybody's, functioning as high as they are. The best metaphor, and I love to speak in metaphors, as Colby has learned. I like to put it on par with, taking a bunch of amateurs in the sports arenas and turning them all into Olympians. Because, across the spectrum in the amateur pool, you're going to have those super high performers who look like they're about ready to make the jump to, the gold medal stands, but you got to put them through their paces to make sure that they can get there. And then you've got the people who are, starting out, they've never done this sport before. And or they've never done sales before. And so it's, helping them understand what it'll take to become, proficient both at this, their chosen field, which is sales, and or leadership, and or however it could look for them into the near future. And basically, instead of sitting back and saying, you, Kira Greer, who's played tennis every once in a while, go be like Serena. Go act like Serena Williams. And it's like, I'll come back to be like, how am I supposed to be like Serena? What does that mean? And it's versus a coaching mindset, which is much more about, here, read these novels, go to these practices, tell me what you're doing different, laying out like a schedule saying, hey, here's the things. And then, allowing them to, as individual practitioners, be successful. Does that make sense?
So it does. And one of the things that that I think of when I think about acceleration is like, this is where you start to think about, you have to measure outcomes at some point, right? Like, you've done your work of building consensus, people are all on the same page and speaking the same language. Now we're looking for an outcome. So how do you measure that? Because this is another place where every sales enablement person I've spoken to has given me a different answer. So like, what is the set of metrics that you look at? And not what should people look at, but specifically you, Kira. Like, doesn't have to be the silver bullet, but I'm curious about your experience. So what's the set of metrics you look at? What do you look to improve? And what tools do you pull from? Or is it softer than that?
Actually, it's that precisely. It is the numbers. And I tend to look at ASP, quarter over quarter. I also tend to look at wins, quarter over quarter. So generally, I should be seeing, as Colby has identified, double-digit changes, and thankfully, I can see that pretty consistently in my profession. So that those are the two core things. And then, of course, anytime I run a program, I have set out metrics at the onset so that I can at least see, 2 weeks prior to an event that I'm developing towards, that I'll have a pre and a post from a behavioral perspective. And I am always developing, always developing anything with a metric in mind, and making sure that I have that clear metric definition before I even put pen to paper, or, I'm writing an email where it's like, okay, I'll get one-off requests like, hey, we need to be trained, or, hey, our people aren't doing this and they're not doing that. And my initial response, and people are getting kind of bored hearing it now, but you got to keep hammering it home. It's like, hey, great, you want training? What are we going to measure as a data point to define success? So if you're telling me that my people don't know how to get on the phone, okay, that's fine. Let's sit down and figure out what are the tactical steps that somebody has to accomplish to get them on the phone. And then it sounds like, hey, just as an idea, we want to see a delta post this event where we're seeing the amount of phone calls being made per rep has increased on an aggregate. As a really tactile example, those are the kinds of requests that I'm always pushing back with. It's like, hey, stop, give me a data point so that I can measure it, so that I can prove to you that this is going to work. I don't want to run around, do all of this heavy lifting unless I have that very specific data point telling me that this change is something that I can prove to you is going to be worth both your time and my time, because we got to do this together.
Yeah, Kira, I couldn't agree more with everything you just said. And getting that alignment, getting those benchmarks so you can measure it is absolutely critical. And I think a lot of what you guys are already measuring is very consistent to what we see organizations measure. But every organization's different, right? There's going to be a broad spectrum on this call. So I think it's like you mentioned, it's what are those metrics? What are the initiatives? Maybe you're a company who has a very broad product portfolio and you want to see an increase in, upsell, cross-sell, or, we're starting to get feedback that we're losing to a certain competitor a lot. Well, it's like you mentioned, Kira, it's like, okay, well, let's go measure it. Like, how often, how much, right? Like, what is the actual win rate or against that competitor, so you can actually provide what you're going to provide as an enablement function to hopefully change that, and then measure the impact. So I couldn't agree more.
I'd love to open this one up to the audience, actually. So audience members, in the Q&A box, tell us a little bit about like the outcomes you expect from sales enablement programs you either run or that your organization runs for you as sellers. What are the measurement pieces that your sales enablement org looks at? one thing that I also wanted to ask on the flip side of this, I'm a big believer that the metrics you choose, the goals you set, drive your behaviors, right? So if you do that intelligently, you get the right behaviors and you get those outcomes. But I also think that if you see an org and you ask them like what they're measuring, and it can tell you a lot about how they're acting. And sometimes like the wrong metrics, you can tell right away, red flag, that's not going well. So Kira, like what are the things that sales enablement leaders should try to not be measured by?
Wow. So what they should not be measured by is, and that's a tough one. The red flags that immediately come to mind have more to do with, if the conversations are all about, well, I need to hold this many trainings, or I need you to, just run this program, and there's no data assigned to it. That's always a red flag for me, simply because what it goes to show is that somebody's not thinking in the same mindset, and there's going to be a bigger lift on the part of the enablement practitioner, which is most likely you, to clarify, okay, this is actually what enablement is. So one of the questions, I guess, from Jason Harris was, for enablement to work, how do you manage senior leadership's desire for enablement versus senior sales leadership's resistance to it? Ooh, that's a good one. Which sort of goes along the lines of, who's driving the conversation and what are the red flags? And again, enablement is not a magic bullet. And it's, it is one of those questions where during the interview process, or even with my ongoing, quarterly business reviews that I actually hold with my senior leaders here, where it's sort of a clear definition of, okay, these are the expectations that I need to set with you. Because I really shouldn't be moving on anything until I've got, XYZ buy-in, because this is going to, clearly define the process for rollout. So case in point,
right.
I don't want to do anything without the sales leadership's buy-in, and that's line managers. I can't rule from on high, but I do have to find that medium ground in between the two, and it's really, again, understanding and knowing the culture of the company. If it is the kind of hierarchical organization where leadership says and everybody does, then that's sometimes really easy. It tends to be a whole bunch of CYA at that point as an enablement professional, versus, if you tend to work in a matricized organization, it's really trying to find the influencers that can speak on your behalf and making sure that you have those tight relationships. If it's a flat org, again, finding those influencers and finding that right mix between, what is it going to take to get the leaders on board so that they can see and recognize the benefit of any program that you want to run. So it's a lot of time spent sometimes, and other times it can just be very hierarchical. It's entirely dependent upon the company. As a process that's been defined, Mark, actually, thank you again for that feedback. He says that it starts with a defined sales process that maps to a buying process, and then maybe working backwards with definitions. Absolutely. If you have that opportunity, yeah, but sometimes, and particularly in hyper-growth SaaS companies, you don't always have that option to say, this is our sales methodology. It would be nice, but, everybody's, got speed in mind over, method sometimes, and it's, picking your battles.
I love that point about like thinking about the shape of the org chart and how you approach building consensus or not, like how you approach building buy-in or finding influence in that. Starting from where the org chart places power is a great idea. Jason had another really good question that I wanted to make sure we got to at some point because we have just a few minutes left. So people, if you have other questions for Kira or Colby, or just want to hear about my dogs, feel free to pop the questions in there. Jason's other question that I liked was, how do you get sellers to think about buyer experience as like their first reason for doing something or not doing something, rather than just trying to follow a rote sales process?
Oh, wow, that's a good one. So Colby, will you advance to the next slide? And that's actually kind of where I come to the things that, best and worst practices, where it's, do assess, do reflect, and do confirm. And definitely don't react, assume, or fly solo. If I could, hashtag all of that for the rest of my career, I think I'd be a lot more successful than I have been. And in many cases, it's really just making sure that you understand the root cause behind, the desire to just go quickly? So, is it that your sellers are thinking about their own agenda because they've got pressure from exterior points? Have you clarified to them? The reflection part is like, have you as an enablement practitioner worked with the leaders to make sure that you're clarifying a process that works, and then going out and confirming, oh no, the leaders have come back and said, no, just sell, it's end of quarter, you've got to hit your number, but have given very little guidance. Well then, hey, going back to the hashtag do not react, it's, do I go back to the leaders and say, from a reaction perspective, you need to coach your reps better on how to set up the buying perspective? Or is it me going, waiting and assessing and reflecting and confirming one more time with Colby, say as a sales leader, it's like, hey, Colby, I'm getting this feedback from, X, Y, and Z that the sellers are pushing through a checklist and they're not being thoughtful, according to all of these other resources. Let's try and figure out what's going on. Can we partner on this? Can we, as a sales leader, can you help me understand, what is the context that I'm not getting? What are the things that are driving people to, fall back to a checklist versus being thoughtful and patient, or creating a buying vision, or even setting out a buyer process? Because again, if I could always skip over the hashtag do not react, do not assume, and do not fly solo, like I cannot tell you how many times when I've jumped ahead and that's bitten me in the butt and egg all over my face because I didn't stop, assess, reflect, and confirm.
One of the frameworks that I used to manage an account management team. Every rep had their own number, right? So one of the things that so I've seen this problem, Jason, where the sellers just kind of, you ask them to get upsells and they just like go around basically hammering the phones and saying, do you want to buy more of X, Y, Z? And not bottoming out to a pain point, basically, was the problem. But one of the things that I found helpful in one-on-one coaching sessions, and is like an overall approach for the team, was to teach everybody the 5 whys framework. So ask them to look at their behavior, ask why they did it that way. And then when they give you an answer, ask why again, and continue on until it's bottomed out to some kind of like, because that's what I was told to do, or some kind of like fundamental where it can't get any further down. And if your bottom out reason is not because it's better for the customer or it's better for the company and the customer, then the behavior at the top of the 5 whys wasn't right. So it kind of lets them see the reasoning and the outcomes from their behaviors. I don't know if that's ever been useful in your experience, Kira, but it worked for me.
And one thing just to add there too, I think for reps to understand why the experience matters is, if you're not talking about, your customer and their pains and their problems and their objectives, what you're probably selling is your product and your features. And a long time ago, actually, while I was at Wildfire, we had, I think it was the CMO of Intuit come in and speak to us. And one of the things that we interviewed her on was, what do you care about when a vendor comes and sells to you? And she was like, it's really interesting. If you come and have a meeting with me, there's really, and there's 2 of us in the room, there's really 4 things at play. There's me and my problems, and there's you and your product. And without using the exact language she used, she said, I only care about 2 of them. What do you think it is? And it's her and her problems, right? And, inevitably sales reps, we're under the gun, right? Like we have quotas, we need to deliver, but slowing the game down and getting focused on the right things inevitably is going to get you to deliver more revenue faster.
And to get at sort of the tactical process from an enablement profession, I always, ask people to reflect on the last big purchase that they had. For some people, that's a car. For some people, it's an iPhone, or it's, the new Google Pixel. And, asking them to be very reflective and very empathetic to their own sales process and their own purchasing process. And it's like, did you tend to go to the person who seemed like they were being consultative and asked you detailed questions, or did you go up to the person who was like, buy, 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 buy? And if you went up to the person who said, buy, 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 was it because you had already made a decision, or because they were, really good at telling you to buy now? And I'll bet you, even, dollars to donuts, it wasn't the person who was in your face saying, buy, 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 buy. It was the person who was being consultative. I mean, really reflect. Let's be honest. Have you ever bought from that, sort of smarmy sales guy? Nah,
Not
probably
once.
not. No. And if you have, you've left with that very bitter taste in your mouth. So, really just being empathetic and making sure that people recognize that this is a human process, and that this is a human interaction.
I love that. And I think we can end there because that ties it all together. Like, this is about people. It's about the seller and the buyer. And, this framework focusing on alignment and then adoption and measured acceleration, 3 A's, the sales enablement role basically acts as that, like, whoa, let's slow down. Let's just take a minute here. Then we'll find the places where we speed up, right? Because we want to be doing everything we do for a reason. I love that. I think that's kind of what it boils down to for me, at least from an outsider's perspective. I learned a lot today, Kira and Colby. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, I'll see you next time on the next Sales Hacker webinar, and we'll send the recording out soon. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.